You enter the story believing collapses happen suddenly, never noticing how the ground beneath society is measured, marked, and quietly prepared. In public squares, order feels comforting because wide spaces and straight lines convince you nothing dangerous could be planned here. You hear officials speak of balance and responsibility, their words arranged carefully, like stones placed to guide a river's flow. Beyond the speeches, documents move between hands faster than rumors, thin pages carrying decisions heavier than monuments. You walk past banks and institutions the way ancestors passed temples, trusting rituals you no longer remember learning. Numbers rise and fall on distant boards, and you mistake motion for health, forgetting even a fever shows activity. Trade routes glow on maps like veins, and you assume circulation means life, never asking who controls the heart. Ships keep moving through ports, containers stacking higher, their patience mistaken for strength rather than pressure. You notice wealth concentrating like heat under glass, but the shine distracts you from the rising temperature. Agreements stretch across borders, invisible threads binding cities together until distance no longer offers protection. You are told dependence is cooperation, and cooperation is peace, so you accept the leash because it is shared. Crises are framed as accidents, yet the same hands always arrive first, already holding the tools. You watch debts roll forward like seasons, predictable and polite, until winter never seems to end. Entire nations begin adjusting their posture, bending slightly, calling it flexibility instead of submission. You sense the design when every solution requires more promises, never fewer. The system praises resilience, not escape, rewarding those who endure the tightening walls. You realize nothing is taken outright. It is refinanced, rescheduled, softened, until resistance feels impolite. Power stops looking violent and starts looking administrative, stamped, filed, and approved. By the time instability is acknowledged, it has already been normalized into routine. This is how the collapse begins, not with chaos, but with planning so careful it feels like order. As days repeat, you notice public life moving like choreography, each step rehearsed until deviation feels physically uncomfortable. Queues lengthen outside offices, not from shortage, but from procedure. Time stretched thin to teach patience as obedience. Forms multiply identical, except for signatures, turning identity into handwriting and existence into compliance. You begin to recognize power by its absence, by how no single figure can be blamed for what everyone enforces. Markets open each morning like theaters' prices, performing confidence, while tension waits backstage. Announcements echo across cities, their tone soothing, their timing precise, arriving just before panic could form. You hear the word stability repeated until it replaces curiosity, dulling questions before they fully emerge. Maps are redrawn quietly, not of borders, but of obligations, lines shifting while flags remain untouched. Infrastructure expands outward, while choices contract inward, progress measured only in distance, traveled, never direction. You start planning your life around approvals, learning instinctively which paths will be denied. Protests shrink into permitted zones, fenced neatly anger, folded into schedules and safety regulations. Currency circulates faster than trust, hands moving quickly, eyes avoiding contact. Wealth rises vertically, lifting towers higher, while streets below grow narrower and darker. You notice history being simplified into slogans, complexity sanded down until memory becomes manageable. Education shifts, tone training, adaptation, rather than understanding, rewarding those who learn not to resist. Cracks appear in public structures, quickly painted over cosmetic repairs, mistaken for strength. You sense the weight of decisions pressing downward, even when no one is visibly pushing. Dependency feels mutual on paper, yet only one side is allowed to walk away. The design becomes clearer when every exit leads back through the same checkpoint. What remains unspoken now shapes everything, guiding collapse with silence rather than force. You begin sensing control, not in commands, but in timing, in how delays arrive precisely when urgency might create movement. Public clocks drift out of sync, each square keeping a slightly different hour, teaching you time itself is negotiable. Transport slows, gently schedules, stretching so distance grows heavier, without any road being closed. You notice goods still arrive, just never where scarcity would spark questions, only where compliance has settled. Insurance replaces assurance protection, sold back to you after risk is carefully introduced. Crises are simulated in drills rehearsed so thoroughly that real ones feel familiar, almost comforting. Aid is distributed conditionally, relief arriving with forms already filled, decisions made before suffering speaks. Borders remain open in theory, yet movement funnels through narrow gates that remember every step you take. Surveillance becomes polite, embedded in convenience watching, disguised as service. You trade privacy for access, convinced doors are more important than walls. Infrastructure hums, constantly reminding you that stopping would be dangerous, even irresponsible. Power stations glow at night like temples, modern shrines demanding uninterrupted devotion. Blackouts occur selectively, darkness used as instruction rather than failure. You learn which neighborhoods dim first and which never lose light. Emergency rules linger after emergencies fade, extended, quietly renewed without debate. Authority spreads horizontally, now diffused across systems, so resistance has no single target. You feel watched, not by eyes, but by processes automatic and tireless. The city keeps functioning, which becomes proof the design is benevolent. Collapse advances, disguised as maintenance, a series of small, reasonable adjustments. By now, direction has replaced choice so completely that you no longer remember standing still. You start noticing how choice is preserved only as a concept, like a museum exhibit protected behind glass. Public options multiply visually, yet every path requires the same permission at the same gate. The language of freedom remains everywhere printed large, while its meaning shrinks quietly. Movement feels allowed only when it follows approved currents, like leaves drifting where water already flows. Those who move against direction are not stopped, only delayed until exhaustion teaches compliance. Access becomes the new currency doors, opening selectively based on invisible scores. You realize inequality no longer looks violent. It looks optimized. Data replaces judgment charts, deciding futures before faces are ever seen. Appeals exist, but they loop endlessly, corridors returning you to the first desk. You learn patience is rewarded, while urgency is treated as instability. Surveillance no longer hides. It advertises itself as safety. Cameras face outward, now convincing you the threat is always elsewhere. The city grows quieter, not from peace, but from synchronization. Public emotion smooths into neutrality extremes, sanded down for efficiency. You feel history flattening peaks removed, so nothing stands tall enough to challenge. Even outrage becomes predictable, arriving on schedule, fading on cue. Participation replaces dissent because involvement feels like influence. You are thanked constantly, gratitude becoming the final contract. The design no longer needs enforcement. Belief does the remaining work. At this stage, collapse feels impossible, which is exactly how it continues. You begin to feel how comfort is rationed, released in careful doses, to keep dissatisfaction from ever fully forming. Public celebrations return brighter than before, timed precisely to reset collective memory. You notice relief always follows compliance, teaching cause and effect without words. Shortages appear selectively, never enough to revolt, just enough to instruct. Scarcity becomes a lesson plan repeated until anticipation replaces demand. Emergency language softens into routine language warnings, losing urgency while authority remains. You adapt faster now, predicting adjustments before they arrive, saving effort by surrendering early. Systems reward foresight that aligns with their needs, punishing imagination that wanders. Even hope is optimized, redirected toward approved futures. You begin thanking the structure for sparing you worse outcomes you never witnessed. Comparison becomes control, showing you examples of collapse elsewhere to justify quiet obedience here. The outside world is framed as unstable, dangerous, irresponsible. Borders feel safer closed, even when you have nowhere to go. You internalize the limits, carrying them with you like a second skeleton. Freedom shifts from action to memory, something discussed rather than practiced. The system stops asking anything new. It only renews what you already accepted. You realize resistance would now require unlearning yourself. Collapse no longer approaches. It lives inside daily procedure. Nothing dramatic happens anymore, which convinces many that nothing is wrong. This is the phase where history later wonders why no one moved. You realize crisis management has become a permanent profession, staffed, budgeted, and rehearsed, like theater that never closes. Headlines shrink into maintenance notes. Urgency replaced by updates that promise continuity above all else. The calendar fills with renewals instead of milestones, life measured by extensions rather than beginnings. You watch leaders rotate while policies remain faces changing, so the structure never has to. Accountability dissolves into committees, responsibility spread thin enough to evaporate. You hear apologies delivered in advance, soft cushions placed beneath every future failure. Risk is redistributed downward while reassurance flows upward, reversing gravity without complaint. Systems begin correcting people instead of errors, adjusting behavior to fit outcomes already chosen. The language of care expands as the space for refusal contracts. You notice how consent is assumed silence recorded as agreement. Public debates feel ceremonial now. Outcomes known arguments performed for closure rather than change. Opposition survives as decoration proof of openness, mounted safely behind rails. You are invited to participate endlessly, never to decide. Feedback loops close tightly input, welcomed only if it confirms direction. You start editing your own thoughts, saving time by removing doubt early. The design reaches maturity when self-censorship feels efficient. Even anger becomes scheduled allotted brief windows before returning to normal. Normal expands to absorb everything, leaving no outside reference point. You sense the collapse no longer needs momentum. It coasts on habit. At this stage, stopping would require imagination strong enough to break routine. You begin noticing how safety language replaces moral language harm, weighed only by acceptable margins. Decisions are justified, statistically suffering averaged until it disappears into charts. You hear compassion spoken fluently, yet rarely see it practiced without conditions. Emergency thresholds are lowered, so alarms never stop ringing, and therefore never shock. You learn that outrage burns energy, while acceptance conserves it, making surrender feel efficient. The system rewards calm faces, mistaking visible peace for internal agreement. Discomfort is reframed as adjustment pain, relabeled as transition. You stop asking why something hurts and start asking how long it will last. Public rituals return to reassure ceremonies designed to release pressure without changing structure. Symbols are refreshed flags, repainted slogans updated, so decay looks like renewal. You notice how language itself tightens, fewer words allowed to describe complex loss. Silence becomes professional, expected praised. Those who speak too clearly are described as disruptive, even if they are accurate. Accuracy loses status to tone, and tone becomes the true offense. You begin measuring truth by its convenience rather than its cost. Over time, conscience feels inefficient, an obstacle to smooth operation. You sense that ethics have been outsourced, handled somewhere above your reach. The structure now governs behavior without needing to convince anyone. Collapse proceeds quietly, not as failure, but as optimized outcome. By now, even imagining repair feels unrealistic, like a luxury from another era. You sense how fear is no longer reactive, but scheduled, arriving in controlled doses that never overwhelm, never disappear. Warnings rotate topics carefully, so anxiety stays warm without ever boiling into action. Threats feel abstract now, distant enough to justify measures without provoking resistance. You learn to fear patterns rather than events, preparing endlessly for something undefined. Preparedness replaces courage, readiness replacing the need to decide. Public drills become social gatherings, seriousness softened into habit. The vocabulary of danger expands, while the meaning of safety contracts. You begin tracking alerts the way others track, weather background noise shaping daily plans. Each new precaution narrows life slightly, but the change is framed as care. You stop asking when safety ends because the question sounds reckless. Risk becomes a story told about others, always elsewhere, always instructive. Images of collapse circulate endlessly, exhausting your ability to imagine alternatives. You are shown futures you should avoid, never ones you could choose. The system governs by rehearsal, practicing fear until response becomes automatic. Eventually, calm itself feels suspicious, something to correct. You catch yourself welcoming alerts because they give structure to unease. Silence feels dangerous now, a gap where uncertainty might enter. Collapse advances through anticipation, not surprise. You remain alert without purpose, awake without direction. This is how fear becomes infrastructure. You begin to sense exhaustion, replacing fear, a dull heaviness settling where urgency once lived. Warnings keep coming, but they slide off your attention, absorbed like rain into pavement. You still follow instructions, not from belief, but from habit that no longer questions itself. Fatigue becomes a feature slowing reaction, just enough to prevent coordinated movement. You notice care messages arriving with softer language designed to soothe rather than alert. The system counts on tiredness, because tired people seek rest, not change. Days blur together routines, merging into a continuous present without edges. You stop marking time because nothing ever resolves. Minor collapses occur constantly framed as adjustments normalized before they register. Repairs replace prevention patches, praised as progress. You hear talk of recovery everywhere, yet no one remembers what recovery means. Hope is offered in installments, small enough not to inspire risk. Collective memory thins history, reduced to slogans easy to carry. You realize forgetting is no longer accidental, but maintained. The future is shortened into manageable horizons, never far enough to threaten design. Long-term thinking is quietly discouraged as impractical. You plan only for continuity, mistaking survival for success. Collapse now feels static, like a background condition, rather than an event. Nothing signals an ending, because endings invite reflection. The design reaches its final strength when people can no longer imagine afterward. You no longer wait for collapse because waiting implies an event, and events have been replaced by conditions. What once felt temporary now feels permanent, not announced, simply accepted through repetition. You notice how language avoids endings, preferring continuity, sustainability, maintenance. The idea of repair feels excessive, almost disruptive compared to smooth continuation. You realize nothing was ever meant to break loudly. Noise would invite attention. The design favored erosion slow enough to feel natural, precise enough to feel inevitable. You understand now that stability was never the goal, only predictability. Predictable people are easier to guide than fearful ones. By removing shock, the system removed urgency. By removing urgency, it removed resistance. You are told this outcome is unfortunate but unavoidable, as if no one chose it. Responsibility dissolves into history written later in passive voice. You search for the moment it could have changed, but every step felt reasonable at the time. That is the elegance of the design. Nothing ever felt like collapse while it happened. When the structure finally names itself, it calls itself normal. Normal becomes the last shield, protecting the design from scrutiny. You realize the tragedy is not loss, but how gently it was taken. Nothing was stolen in panic. Everything was surrendered calmly. History will debate causes, but never feel the pressure you lived inside. And this is how financial collapse proves it was never an accident, but a plan patiently completed.